Lock the doors! order.
The ayes to the right, 330. The noes to the left, 231.
The ayes to the right, 330. The noes to the left, 231. So the ayes have it. The ayes. Thank you. Point of order, Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a historic moment for all of us. And of course, we must reflect on the fact that this is the first time that a part of the Union, a country of the Union, is having something done to it which it resents. The Scottish Government and the SNP have made it clear over the course of the last 3.5 years that we were seeking to compromise, that we were seeking to make sure that what the people of Scotland voted for, which was staying within the European Union, that our rights as EU citizens was to be respected. Madam Deputy Speaker, it was interesting that when the Minister was summing up today, that he made no reference to the powerful speeches that had been made by my colleagues about that desire for our rights to be respected, and that we do not consent under any circumstances to the people of Scotland and our country being taken out of the European Union against our will, because let's make no mistake, that's exactly as to what is happening. And of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, yesterday the Scottish Parliament voted overwhelmingly not to give its consent. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a constitutional crisis, because we will not and we cannot accept what has been done to us. And I say to the Prime Minister, and I say to the Government, respect the election.
No, that wasn't me saying sit down. The honourable gentleman can finish his point. For God's sake. Briefly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, but this is an important point. In the election that we held last December, the people of Scotland stood by the Scottish National Party on the basis of our right to choose. We will not accept being taken out of the European Union, and I say to the Prime Minister, respect democracy, respect the election result, respect the right of the people of Scotland to choose our future. We will have our referendum, Prime Minister, and Scotland will remain an independent European country.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order, but he knows and the House knows it was not a point of order but a point of debate. I appreciate in the circumstances I've allowed him to make his point, and I'm quite sure he will find a way of continuing the debate. And I'm also quite sure that the Prime Minister will find a way of continuing to answer his points in the debate. Thank you. Point of order, Mr. Cunningham.
Fine, thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. You may not be aware, but Hitachi at Newton Aycliffe, which employs many of my constituents, have today announced they're making a third of their workforce redundant, meaning the loss of around 250 jobs. The company says that the restructure is not being taken lightly. It says it reflects the need to remain competitive and put the factory on a more sustainable and long-term footing by winning more manufacturing orders in the future. These lost jobs, however, Madam Deputy Speaker, could be the thin end of the wedge, as the announcement could mean have a knock-on effect on jobs within the supply chain. Can you advise me, please, if you've heard from the Government of any intention to make a statement on these job losses and what action they are planning to take to assist the company at this very difficult time?
I hear the honourable gentleman's point of order, and I deduce that what he is really saying is that he wishes to bring ministers to the dispatch box in order to answer the point which he has eloquently made. I would suggest to him that at the beginning of next week he will find a way of doing that. by an urgent question or some other form of bringing his important point, which I'm sure the House will appreciate matters enormously in his constituency, to be discussed here properly in the Chamber. Thank you.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Karen Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it is a pleasure to see you once more in the chair for this debate. Now, I'm very pleased to be given this debate. It is obviously a very significant time in Parliament following this evening's vote. And I hope this evening to shed some light on how complicated VAT rules that have evolved over time in the NHS are now creating incentives for trusts to behave in a way that is contrary to the government's own objectives, particularly with reference to the investment of capital and the implementation of the NHS long-term plan. Now, I'm pleased to see the Health Minister is answering this debate. My expertise on the finer aspects of taxation policy and its operation is fairly limited, and I don't believe the Minister is a tax expert either. But before I came to this place, I spent most of my professional life as an NHS manager, and I do know a lot about planning and delivering health services, including new hospitals, and the Minister has some very clear policy objectives as the government seeks to implement the NHS plan, which is predicated on place-based commissioning and improved capital infrastructure, and I believe he has an obligation as the Health Minister to support NHS leaders with greater clarity on how the rules operate. Now, indeed, the Office of Tax Simplification seems to agree with me that this is a problem. Their 2017 report recorded frustration, and I quote, about a number of cases where the VAT position was unclear, with HMRC and the government tendering departments having different interpretations of the rules. It noted that the VAT liabilities should be clearly outlined during the tendering process for public services and contracts. Now, the government also appears to agree, and the spring statement announced a policy paper. Vague on details, announcement was made to explore a potential reform to the VAT refund rules for central government with the aim of reducing administrative burdens and improving public sector productivity. And the 2019 OTS update noted that that spring statement had involved a commitment to a policy paper on VAT simplification and the public sector. Now, I do believe it's important to raise this issue now because as we move towards implementing the NHS plan, we all need to understand exactly how the government will allocate the necessary funding for hospital improvements and other infrastructure projects. And the potential of VAT savings will increasingly become a major consideration for trusts up and down the country. Now, of course, capital investment is always welcomed, and indeed it is long overdue. Now, whether you think there are going to be 40 or 6 new hospitals, my sympathies really are with finance directors and those managers within trusts who are faced with the task of maximising these investments and managing the competing interests of recruiting and retaining staff, developing integrated local health systems, and securing local public trust in their plans. And it is my belief that there is an underlying problem here, that the priorities of HMRC and the Department of Health and Social Care are not aligned. The problem manifests itself in a number of ways. Firstly, a decade of underinvestment in our health service has led to NHS trusts desperately trying to recover whatever finances might be possible. Now, although some of the VAT rules and debates go back decades, and before the Minister rises, and I hope he doesn't in response, to say that the last Labour government used rules to involve the private sector and responsible for some of this, and I get up to respond and say, well, actually it all started under Margaret Thatcher's outsourcing, and we simply don't help anyone. I want to be more helpful than that tonight. So that was the last comment I had back, so I'm just stemming that at the pass. The real explosion in this issue really came from the direction of the coalition government and the creation of contracted out services regulations. The HMRC manual for VAT government and public bodies from 2012 stated, and it's a long quote, but that government departments and health authorities have been encouraged to contract out services to the private sector, which would have traditionally been performed in-house over many decades. But it is recognised that many of those services would be subject to VAT, and where they were acquired for non-business purposes, the non-reclaimable VAT could act as a disincentive to contracting out, which was then the policy of the government. It was therefore decided to compensate government departments and health authorities by a direct refund mechanism, which is provided for in section 41(3) of the VAT Act from 1994. Now, under this provision, the Treasury issues a direction commonly known as the Contracting Out Direction, which lists both the government departments and health authorities that are eligible to claim refunds of VAT and the services on which VAT can be refunded. Essentially, for the lay people, amongst myself included, under the regulations, full VAT can be recovered on the cost of a managed service which provides premises that could be used for delivering healthcare. And of course the private sector was very pleased, as it meant that they could now, as they saw it, compete on a level playing field with the public sector. But really, we should all view any tax breaks or loopholes with extreme suspicion, as they do lead to reduced revenue for the Exchequer, and there should always be a compelling public interest for any tax breaks or loopholes. And after this direction, and as austerity really bit, more and more complex arrangements have been set up. Now, following the OTS 2017 report, I'm sure many in the accounting departments across the public sector were relieved to hear last year's spring statement, when the then Chancellor announced a consultation on VAT in the public sector. And this could mean a potential reform to VAT refund rules to reduce the administration and improve public sector productivity. However, rather concernedly, the language of the spring statement and the background to that statement appears to suggest a widening of VAT refunds for those engaged in services, and that again is reducing the amount of VAT paid by public sector contractors back to the Treasury. And I'm worried that the Treasury is going to make this situation work. Now, my good colleague in the other place, Lord Hunt, followed the whereabouts of this review in October when he asked for an update on progress of the review and was told by the Earl of Courtown to expect a policy paper for public consultation in the coming months. Now, I know we've all been busy, but, Madam Deputy Speaker, the world awaits, and it would be really helpful if tonight the Minister could provide the House with an update, either tonight or afterwards in writing, on that review. Now, the area that has really attracted a great deal of attention with regard to VAT avoidance, and that myself and many honourable colleagues, including my honourable friend, the member for Blaydon, who visited the Treasury to talk about this last year, is the issue of establishing wholly owned companies in the NHS trusts. Now, these trusts can be seen up and down the country from Northumberland to Yeovil. They vary greatly between those that try to remain part of the NHS to those that position themselves as separate corporate businesses only loosely connected to the public and patients. Most of them are set up to deliver a full range of facilities management services, cleaning, catering, porters, security, and then charging the parent trust a PFI unitary fee for this managed service. To avoid charges of tax avoidance, which created a degree of discussion in the media, we've heard now how the new arrangements are supposed to be better from a service delivery aspect, ostensibly solving problems around estates and facilities management and how staff are managed. There is no evidence of this. In every case, almost all the benefits, and some of them very considerable financial benefits to the Trust, appear to come from these tax changes and not service improvement. Many of the schemes have resulted in thousands of NHS staff being taken out of the NHS and transferred against their will into wholly owned subsidiaries. This then increases fragmentation, and where there are examples of where these companies fall out with their parent trust, there are also arguments about which organisation is responsible for what and who pays. Far worse is that in some cases the use of a separate company is used to undermine national agreements on terms and conditions. Around 50 such proposals have been progressed or are in the pipeline, and highly worrying is that these were advanced in secret, without consultation with patients or the workforce involved. And when FOI requests were made for business access to the business cases that sought to justify these changes, trade unions and others were denied access with claims that the information was commercial and confidential. Just this week, the Pharmaceutical Journal reported that 34% of trusts had outsourced their pharmacy services to a commercial firm, 16% have created wholly owned subsidiaries. The practice is now very widespread. Now, despite this, the examples at Bradford recently and Frimley Health have been vigorously opposed by the Unison in particular, and it appears that both proposed schemes have now been stopped. Good news for thousands of low-paid staff who wish to remain NHS employees. Now, thanks to the considerable pressure put on NHS improvement, trusts must now, in effect, ask for permission before they create a subsidiary company, although far from being a device to prevent the practice, it does seem that it really has been used as a scheme to embellish some badly written business cases so that the changes can go ahead anyway with a veneer of justification. But again, under some pressure, that process has been reviewed. And whilst in the short term it appears individual trusts will gain through tax advantages offered by the wholly owned companies, other trusts will not. And it means less VAT for the Treasury. But this Treasury seem unconcerned about the lost income. The practice itself is not strategic, collaborative, or a positive solution to the problems that the trusts face. And it's not about better employment. The NHS has agreed national terms and conditions for a very good reason, because overall it works. All these schemes try to do is undermine those national agreements and offer staff less favourable terms to save money. And two-tier workforces is not a good way to progress. This is a point I made successfully a few years ago in my own area of Bristol. The North Bristol Trust at the time, under considerable financial pressure, was considering adopting a wholly owned company. But following local discussions, including with Unison, they recognised that in the local highly competitive market for staff, and at a time when they needed to start collaborating on service development, they needed to not do this outsourcing. Creating a second and third tier workforce made no sense operationally and gave the wrong messages to staff and the public about valuing the all-important workforce across the entire Bristol health economy, and they didn't do it. Now, as I touched on in my opening remarks, the controversy over VAT and how it applies to the NHS is relevant to infrastructure investment, because the temptation will be for trusts to set to benefit from the new capital, and I accept there's new capital, which is good, to avoid paying VAT in order to significantly reduce the direct ongoing costs, which is why it's so important that the government gives careful consideration to how the investment's going to be made. Now, I believe the choices made by the government on this issue will reflect how well it understands both the importance of the NHS estate itself as part of the health ecosystem and the direction of the long-term plan. And I can't emphasise enough, and I do think honourable members in this House do actually understand this, that this is not a technical dry subject, that capital is crucial to the delivery of quality healthcare. And it's not a burden on the system. I believe it's time that all of us need to show we understand that we need a joined-up strategy and proper investment. The thing that I kept at the forefront of my mind as an NHS manager, and I do now as a local representative, that the health service, wholly funded by the taxpayer, and the public have great attachment to people and place when they're engaging with healthcare. Buildings are so much more than a pile of bricks to sweat the assets of, or empty vessels to lease for maximum return. Buildings really are that physical manifestation of local people's love for and connection to their local health service. Local people are not overly concerned with how services are developed, but they do not expect their health service to be behaving in a way that is constantly trying to exploit tax loopholes or penalise staff. Now, for 15 years or so, I've been a supporter of the concept of place-based commissioning, by which I mean local collaboration across the public sector, making good use of publicly owned estate to deliver quality health services and maximising the value of the taxpayer's pound. And place-based commissioning has been the direction of travel for some time, knocked off course by the Health and Social Care Act, but with the hope of getting back on track once the long-term plan is in place. So whilst I understand the setting up of a subsidiary might make sense in the short term for individual trusts, it makes no sense for the wider health economy, or indeed the whole NHS. We must move from a competitive short-term market-driven approach at a micro level to a collaborative approach focused on overall gains. And the logic of the VAT exploitation and wholly owned companies practice is based on a very old idea now of trusts having autonomy, behaving like businesses and competing. It's out of date and directly at odds with the NHS plan, which is built around place-based solutions like the sustainability and transformation partnerships and integrated care schemes. And on contrary, the fundamental principle underpinning these initiatives and the government's own strategy is greater collaboration across the system, which absolutely includes the use of buildings and any capital investment. Now, another example of what those running the health service are trying to grapple with is to do with GP commissioning and the new primary care networks. And one of my last jobs was also running a GP commissioning group, so I do understand how difficult it is to get practices to work together and to align their businesses. But last summer, the NHS published a document called the Primary Care Network DES, which is the way in which the health service funds these proposals. And it sought to give guidance about VAT in the new primary care networks. And the author goes to some pains to set out over several pages what NH England expects will be the best approach. And then at the end of the document comes to the following caveat, and again I quote, "Although we anticipate the VAT treatment to follow the above analysis, it is not straightforward. Practices, GP practices, should note that Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs has not yet agreed the position described in this document, and they are the authority responsible for agreeing, administering and collecting VAT." Now, Mr Speaker, if the guidance is going out on services from the government and NHS England about how to set up these new organisations without really knowing how HMRC are going to treat them, how on earth can we expect frontline people to develop good services? Now, finally, if I may just add another issue which is very local to my constituents that I've been working on for the last 5 years. For the last 5 years, HMRC, and it's to do with GP employment status. For the last 5 years, HMRC have been reviewing the employment status of GPs providing NHS out-of-hours services, now called Integrated Urgent Care Services. During this period, demand for GP services has risen and the need identified for NHS England for a substantial, i.e. 5,000 plus increase in GP has not yet been met with whole-time equivalents. Now, based on arrangements in place since the formation of the NHS, GPs have continued to work on a self-employed basis, and this remains the desired option for many of them. Although this, of course, is a subject of some political debate over the number of years, that is the position as people understand it. Now, Bristock is a local GP organisation based in my constituency of Bristol South, which provides urgent care services to the NHS and has been faced with 5 years of uncertainty with its workforce. Because HMRC do not accept the legitimacy of independent GPs working on a self-employed basis, even though this correctly reflects the way services are contracted based on professional and legal advice. Now, that is a separate debate about how they're funded. But if HMRC change the GP status, it firstly increases the risk that GPs will not be willing to work, and secondly, it increases the cost to the NHS. Now, both of these have a negative impact on local NHS services, reducing GP capacity at a time when we need more and costing more, which will ultimately lead to a greater cost for the Treasury. The priority has to be on patient safety and care, and Bristock have continued to fight for this focus in order to maintain the best possible level of GP availability. However, HMRC state their focus is simply on, quote, employment status, and not any wider implications of any change, whereas NHS England indicate they cannot get involved with determining employment status for GPs who are an essential part of the NHS workforce. Now, this leaves the provider, Bristock, vulnerable to financial and workforce loss whilst doing everything possible to maintain a service. So the plea from them, and me on behalf of my constituents, is can the overall strategy for the GP workforce be reviewed to ensure that the key priorities and objectives are aligned with regard to any change in employment status? And on this particular issue, I think it is unacceptable nonsense for them to spend 5 years between the two government departments, and I would ask the Minister if he would be willing to meet with me and Bristock to better understand the problem. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope this evening I have impressed upon the Minister not only the preposterous nature of this VAT problem, but also how critical it is we sort out this loophole now, through proper consultation with the NHS and an urgent publication of that VAT review. Finance directors particularly need the support to make decisions that align with the strategic vision of the long-term plan, not that are at odds with it. And to do this, guidance from HMRC and the policies of the Department of Health and Social Care must be joined up. And if the government is, as it's indicated, supportive of the strategic direction of the NHS plan, then this must mean supporting local health economies to flourish through the collaborative partnerships integral to those SDPs and integrated care systems. They simply can't work if trusts and other delivery partners are in competition with each other. So after a decade of fairly imprudent underinvestment and failing policy, we really are at a crossroads, and we need to get this right. If we can level the playing field for all trusts through proper funding, consistent and sensible VAT rules that don't divert time and effort away from the objectives of the trust to serve their local patient population, then I think we could have every reason to start being positive about that potential of that local place-based commissioning success. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is a pleasure to see you back in the chair in your new role as Deputy Speaker and Chairman of Ways and Means. May I congratulate the Honourable Lady, the Member for Bristol South, for securing this debate. I know it's an important subject for the Honourable Lady who's raised this issue on many occasions, but she's right, it's actually an important subject for all of us. Capital, the buildings our NHS operates out of, and while it is a shame there are not many members in the chamber, I hope that quality makes up for a lack of quantity, and I think that's certainly the case both with the speech we've just heard, but also I see the Honourable Lady, the Member for Blaydon, who if I recall, tabled and held a debate on this subject almost a year ago on that, so it's a pleasure to see her here as well. The Honourable Lady, I think, was perhaps being unduly modest in her opening remarks about her knowledge of this subject, her expertise in this area. And while it's always a pleasure to see her stand up and speak about this, I always respond with a certain degree of, or watch with a certain degree of trepidation, because she does know her subject extremely well. My knowledge, I hasten to add, around VAT and tax rules is rather more limited. And although I spent a period of time as a board member on a PCT board many years ago, I suspect my knowledge base will not be as deep as hers. However, I will endeavour to respond to all the points she's made. I would also recognise the article that she wrote that was published this morning on Politics Home, which highlights a number of these issues as well. If I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will start with addressing the capital investment programme the government has set out and the impact of VAT on that, and then I'll move to the wholly owned subsidiary points and some of the subsequent points the Honourable Lady mentioned. So in respect of VAT, the VAT position with the new health infrastructure plan hospitals, the new 40 hospitals we will be building, in the tax code, VAT will be payable by hospital trusts involved in constructions, reflecting that these are new builds. And we would expect the appropriate HMRC regulations to be adhered to. However, as she has touched on in setting out the background to the VAT rules, VAT chargeable on supplies of goods and supplies in the UK is collected by HMRC on behalf of the government. Therefore, all monies received in this way are reinvested in public services. In addition, I would say the funding provided in relation to the 40 new hospital build projects, and indeed other capital schemes, includes provision for the VAT charged by the suppliers involved in the developments. There may also be scope for an element of VAT reclaim on aspects of those projects, which would of course be determined and calculated on a case-by-case basis and in line with the VAT regulations and rules which she has alluded to. The overall funding allocation for HIP has been built up by overall cost estimates of the schemes, inclusive of VAT. However, of course, the final exact amount of VAT that would be payable would be determined once the individual schemes have been fully scoped and costed. Current VAT rules, as I say, would apply, and VAT recovery will be assessed for each scheme in line with the rules set out in both Section 41 of the 1994 Act and the HM Treasury Contracting Out Direction. So, as I say, I'd emphasise that in broad terms, we have, within the estimated cost of those schemes, made allowance for VAT provision. Now, as the Honourable Lady noted, it was outlined in the spring statement of this year that there are longer-term plans currently being considered by Her Majesty's Treasury to review the Section 41 VAT rules, and as she alluded to potentially either allow for full VAT reclaim for NHS bodies on their purchase of goods or services, or indeed to remove VAT reclaims entirely from them. The VAT review, if I may call it that in this context, or policy paper, will be publishing a call for evidence in due course. And while I know she would like me to give an exact date, I hope she will forgive me for not making announcements which are possibly more appropriate for Treasury ministers to make. But I will ensure that her request for early sight of when that is likely to be is conveyed to the Financial Secretary for the Treasury, and I hope that he will be able to respond to her swiftly with further information on that. What I would also say is, in the context of that forthcoming call for evidence, I would encourage her and indeed others to contribute. She has a lot of knowledge and expertise on this, and I suspect in encouraging her to contribute, I'm pushing at an open door, because I suspect she will be certainly doing that. But I know my honourable friend, the Financial Secretary, will be very pleased to hear from her. Wholly owned subsidiaries, which she focused both in her article and in her speech on, and the Honourable Lady, the member for Blaydon, focused her debate around a year or so ago. While there can be, as she's mentioned, VAT advantages of forming wholly owned subsidiary companies, we are clear that they cannot and should not be set up for the purposes of VAT avoidance, and we're very clear in writing out to all provider trusts in September of 2017 to remind them of their very clear tax responsibilities. I would say, and this is where I may slightly provoke the Honourable Lady, given her plea earlier, I would say that the origins of this position do date back to 2004 and subsequently the Act consolidating this in 2006, but she is right to highlight the changes subsequent to that, the 2012 Act and similar. So I think it is a position which has evolved under governments of both parties, but she is right to highlight, I think she is looking to the future rather than seeking to look at where we've come from on this. We would expect all NHS providers to follow this guidance when considering any new arrangements or different ways of going down the wholly owned subsidiary route. Now, there can be advantages in that route, as my right honourable friend, currently the Brexit Secretary, and my predecessor set out, both for employees in terms of flexibility and choice, and commercial advantages for those NHS bodies setting them up, including things such as enabling providers to employ staff on more flexible and in some cases more generous terms and conditions. I emphasise in some, and I know I see the Honourable Lady Member for Blaydon just watching me carefully, but also in providing more efficient services in some cases to other trusts and being able to attract staff from the local employment market and giving greater flexibility to the operation of that organisation. They are, yes, of course I will.
Giving way. And he said very carefully, some staff may be advantaged. Does he accept that the vast majority of staff, especially those women, very often, in lower paid jobs, are not benefiting from this, and that, in fact, they're losing out in pension contributions? When we met the Treasury ministers last year, we were told that it's a matter for the Health Department to decide what its policy is. Will he now commit to redressing that right?
Yeah.
I thought I was going to provoke the Honourable Lady to intervene on me, and it is nonetheless a pleasure that she's done so. I mean, she does highlight disparities there, but I would say that it is wrong to suggest that is even within taking out wholly owned subsidiary countries within the NHS more broadly, an exact commonality of terms and conditions, pension arrangements. There are differences there already. What I will commit to do, and I was going to mention this at the end, but I'll say it now, I'm very happy to meet both with her and the Honourable Member for Bristol South to discuss this more broadly in the context of Department of Health and Social Care responsibilities in the NHS, and also the point that the Honourable Lady made about self-employed GPs and independent GPs, so I'm very happy to have that meeting with her. We may have to revert to the Treasury at some point for technical points, but I'm very happy to have that meeting. I am very conscious that in the 2 minutes or so I have left to me, that there is a limit to how much I will be able to say, but I'm happy to pick up other points in that subsequent meeting. She is right about buildings. It is right that we are building 40 new hospitals. It is right that we are investing capital in our NHS infrastructure. But she's also right to say, yes, we shape those buildings, but in talking about place-based approaches, they shape us too, and they shape our communities. So it's absolutely right we get this right. And in terms of place-based commissioning, I was a cabinet member on Westminster City Council for many years in the dim and distant past when I had more hair and it wasn't grey, and sat on the PCT board at the same time. And there are clearly, where it's worked for local circumstances, there are clearly opportunities there as well. But I do think that autonomy remains important, because while consistency and clarity is vital, so too is enabling local autonomy to address local needs and specific local circumstances. So I think we need to be a little bit careful around that. I will conclude with about a minute to go before Madam Deputy Speaker stops me in saying, I'm sorry we don't have more time for this debate, because it is an important debate, and I'm sorry there aren't more members here, because I think it is something that would benefit all members to be involved in. And I look forward to any future such debates. I congratulate the Honourable Lady on bringing this forward. She is right to highlight this issue. I hope she will take an active part in putting forward her views to the Treasury review and call for evidence when that comes forward. I would very much, as I say, look forward to continuing this discussion, if not on the floor of the House, in a meeting subsequently. And I hope and believe we probably will be debating this at some point across the floor of the House in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.
House of Commons sound. House of Commons sound.